right. Hi, everyone. It's exciting to be live again.
Yeah, I know, right?
Hey, Kain. So this panel is about governing and scaling billion-dollar protocols, as you've done with Synthetix. I want to start with the governing part, because I think that's kind of one of the key things that makes DeFi and Web3 different from scaling any other organization to $1 billion, billion users.
Sure.
So with governance, you made, I think, the conscious decision to go into decentralization very gradually. Can you talk about why you chose that route as opposed to starting out fully decentralized? And what are some of the pros and cons?
Yeah, so I think for us, we made a decision, like at a software level very early, to have non-immutable contracts, which at the time was fairly controversial. It's still a little controversial, but it was definitely very controversial, and we got a lot of flack for that. But by choosing to have contracts that were not immutable, that were upgradable, it forced us into this path where we had to consider how we could sort of chip away at any centralized aspects of the protocol as quickly as we could, right? So, we started off, we were an open source software foundation. There were a team of, about 10 people who kind of controlled all the contracts, could upgrade them at will. And then, we realized that we were going to need, over time, to kind of hand this control over to the community. And it took a while, but it was something that we thought if we made small iterative changes and experimented with, we could, not put ourselves in a situation where we did something we couldn't unwind. And so that was kind of the, I guess, the overall thesis we had was, start off with something that is very centralized. We've got a lot of control and upgradability around, and then slowly decentralize. And then, as we've gotten probably the last 12 to 18 months, we've accelerated that decentralization and kind of really handed all the governance over to, the community and token holders.
And so, for teams considering how to do this process, for you starting out more centralized, I think one of the main pros of doing that is being able to handle difficult situations quickly. Like you had a couple of, or at least one hack.
More than a couple. More than a couple.
Yeah. So how did that kind of help? And how would a team that's fully decentralized manage that?
I mean, again, when we were designing these contracts, it was 2017, so the tooling wasn't really there. And so I think my view has evolved over the years, where originally I kind of believed that it was okay to be centralized and start off and slowly decentralize, just because we didn't have the tools to start off fully decentralized. I think that we're now in a position where if you are launching a protocol today, this idea of a DAO first governance model is still probably the optimal path, rather than starting off with the foundation or some centralized entity or some centralized components. There are obviously trade-offs, but even with those trade-offs today, you can set up a structure where there might be a small group of people that have had the authority delegated to them to be able to control the protocol and respond to things quickly. They're paid by the protocol to do it. They have all the tools in place to be able to do it. And I think we're just in a much better place in the space today than we were 4 years ago, when you kind of had to design all this stuff from scratch, and if you got it wrong, you went really wrong. So I think now my view is very much launch with a DAO, start with something that's as decentralized as you can make it, keep the upgradability, but make sure that the upgradability is kind of controlled by token holders in some way through delegated democracy or some other mechanism.
Oh, that's so interesting. So if you if you were founding Synthetix today, would you make it a DAO first?
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, ALAN, which is a protocol that I've been working on as a bit of a side project, it's totally decentralized, totally DAO first. There's going to be a token distribution that's going to happen, and then the token holders are going to get together and work out how to govern the protocol.
So cool. Do you think that all the regulatory pressure, especially in the US, will that push more and more protocols to do it in this way, in the decentralized first way?
Possibly. Like, I don't think we really know enough yet about what the regulatory kind of environment is going to be like for a pure DAO approach. We haven't kind of seen it yet. I think in most cases when regulators are talking to people in the space, it's people who still have a foundation or like a private entity that's like a labs, situation that employs all the engineers do the work, and then they release, contracts onto Ethereum and kind of let the community govern it. So I think until we either get some clarity from regulators or we start to, unfortunately maybe see regulation through enforcement, it's going to be hard to know as an engineer who's starting from today, what are the implications of me, launching this DAO first situation and putting out like a token with, pure kind of community control. Will I have some liability or will there be any implications for me? It's pretty unknown at the moment. I still think it's the optimal path, and I think we are seeing more people do it because it looks more like open source software, and it looks more like, especially in the US, a freedom of speech argument. But I do think that there's still a lack of clarity, which is unfortunate.
Do you think that lack of clarity will take development outside of the US? And like, how are you seeing that with Synthetix? Are more people leaving the US because of?
I think, there's a lot of innovation in the US, and I don't think that you can fully squash that. I think it's going to be here regardless of what the kind of regulatory environment looks like. But it is, certainly has a chilling effect, right? I know a lot of people who are either running projects who live in the US or who are considering starting projects, and they're genuinely concerned about the implications. They want, more clarity. I think in Australia, we've been pretty lucky. Our regulators have been fairly hands-off, and there's other jurisdictions where, like Singapore, for example, where they've been fairly permissive and kind of open about allowing this innovation to take place, provided that something is not an outright scam or really problematic. But I do think you need to have regulatory clarity. Without that, people start potentially making bad decisions or uninformed decisions that they otherwise wouldn't make. When, in my experience, most of the people in the space are, I've said this before publicly many times, like they're very aligned with regulators in the sense that we're trying to achieve, open and fair markets. This is just a different tool set for achieving that same outcome versus, a very kind of restrictive regulatory regime.
I agree. So speaking about this very particular way of growing companies or organizations in a decentralized way, governed by token holders and just a DAO. How do you think Synthetix would have grown as a company? Just like comparing Web 2 with Web 3. Do you think the path to becoming a almost $2 billion protocol would have been faster as a company?
I actually think it would have been slower. My reasoning for that is that even in the early days when we were a foundation and we were domiciled in Australia, we had a pretty small but very engaged community. And if you look back at all of the changes that have happened since maybe late 2018 or something like that, the vast majority of those changes were driven by the community. So having a highly engaged base of people who had very strongly aligned incentives was very powerful. And in fact, I've said this many times, there were a number of things which I, as the dictator or CEO or whatever you want to call it, right, would have said, no, you can't do, that the community said, actually, sorry, we are going to do this.
Like
right?
what?
We had a monetary policy change. So I had this great idea, being a recovering Bitcoin maxi, that when we started inflation, that we would have like this halvening. Right? And so like every year the inflation would halve, and it seemed like a really good idea at the time. And we got about 6 months into that process, and one of our community members was like, this is really dumb. Like there's no need to do this. We have much better tools. We can have like a nice smooth inflation curve. And I was like, no, we shouldn't do it. It's a really bad idea. we've already changed the monetary policy once. We don't want to change it again. People will start to worry that it could change, arbitrarily at any time. And the community basically said, you're an idiot, we're changing it. And they did. And now it's been changed, and it's actually worked out really well. Everyone's happy with it. And
wow.
There was a lot of analysis that was done into why this was a better mechanism. And that sort of thing coming not just internally from a company, like this is not, the senior VP of something turning up and saying, I've got a great idea. This is some random guy in New Zealand saying, hey, I've got this idea and I want to push it through, and being able to actually get that executed.
That's so cool. Okay, so to you, in your experience, the kind of wisdom of crowds or like a community has proven to be more effective in running an organization than a top-down, traditional corporate structure?
Yes, in the sense of, you surface ideas, right? And so, ideas that might get squashed or, might be ignored or whatever, in the community, you have this really nice kind of, Taleb has this idea of really good ideas will continue to surface, right? So wait for something to kind of, the longer something's around, the more likely it is that it's an important thing. And so we've had many times where there's been discussions 6 months or 12 months before about some idea or some concept, and it just kind of peters out. No one really gets behind it, and then it kind of comes back and it becomes this recurring theme, and then the community drives it forward. And of course, you could have that sort of thing in a top-down hierarchical organization, but in those organizations, you have these weird incentive misalignment sometimes where someone who has a vested interest in the system being a certain way is going to fight that change, right? And in an environment where it's very flat, it's very ideas driven, ideas tend to kind of percolate up and bubble up and get implemented eventually if they're good ideas. And the bad ideas kind of tend to fade away.
So interesting. As Ryan mentioned, Synthetix was the protocol that spearheaded this idea of liquidity mining and token rewards. And it really kind of took off in DeFi summer last year, and it's been kind of a staple in DeFi since then. Most protocols will incentivize users with their own token rewards. How big do you think liquidity, or how important a piece should liquidity mining be in scaling DeFi protocols?
So I think it's probably Livepeer that deserves the credit for this idea, or at least a component of that idea. They had this concept of distributing tokens based on performing some action. But if you really go all the way back, it's just Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin paid you to learn how to use Bitcoin, right? Anyone who ever spent days or weeks trying to get CG Miner working back in the bad old days of 2012, 2013, if you weren't being paid to do that, or you weren't a lunatic, there was no reason to go through that process, right? It was really painful, it was annoying, but the reward was you were going to get some ownership in this piece of software. If you could get it installed and you could run a node and you could be a miner, and back then the block reward was 50 BTC or something. So there were really strong incentives, I think, back then. And when we changed our monetary policy and went from this fixed supply token to an inflationary token, that was kind of the reasoning behind it. That there was no, what we saw is that there was no incentive for people who are holding tokens to stake. Whether they staked or they didn't, they just had a fixed amount of the network. And when we changed the monetary policy and said, okay, if you don't stake, you're going to be inflated out. And if you do stake, you will get a larger portion of the network. That changed the game and realigned incentives. And all of a sudden, we saw staking start to go up a lot. And I think even more importantly, we saw the engagement and understanding of how the software actually worked go up as well. Because people were willing to put in the time to learn how it worked. And it's a fairly complicated thing. And so there wasn't much desire or need to do it until we changed that policy and said, you must learn this, otherwise you're going to be punished, or if you do, you're going to be rewarded.
So I think there's this debate on liquidity mining on whether projects should wait for product market fit before introducing a token, or should they just start with a token right away to make sure that they get users and they start scaling up quickly? what's your view on that?
I mean, I'm a token maxi, so I think like the more tokens, the better. It's a really good way of ensuring that you have incentive alignment, right? Like if you've got a token, and we see this all the time. People launch a token, they don't even necessarily know what it's supposed to do. Probably Yearn is the best example of this, right? Like Andre just YOLOing a token with some crazy monetary policy, no idea what was going on with it, didn't really even care about the monetary policy that much, to be honest, right? And the community kind of came and formed around it and said, this is a thing that we care about and we want to have a percentage of and we want to have in alignment with, and you get this amazing community that's now probably one of the best and most decentralized examples of governance in crypto. So I think that doesn't happen if Andre just launches the contracts and there's no token there.
Yeah. So okay. So we're coming up to the end of the panel, and I think we need to touch on some of the more controversial aspects of token governance.
Sure.
And that is how this system is really turning into a plutocracy. So, and it's in scaling DeFi protocols that this becomes a real issue. The bigger the amount, the larger the amount of money, the higher the incentive for the system to become corrupt. So how can protocols avoid that? And do you think that DeFi is in a position right now to avoid that path of becoming corrupt?
So direct token voting, I think, pretty obviously leads to forms of plutocracy, right? Chilling effects, et cetera. And even direct token voting with delegation, I think, kind of devolves into that fairly quickly as well. So I'm not an advocate for that at all. I think what we've done with Synthetix is we've advocated this idea of delegated democracy, right? And particularly, we've structured it in a way where the whales can we have a council of 8 people. Maybe the whales can get together and collude and get like 4 people on the council. But as you go further and further down, it becomes harder for that collusion to be efficient and stack this council. And even more importantly, each of the council members have their own reputation. They're community members that are high profile. They've got incentive alignment. They might not necessarily have that many tokens. And in many cases, I think for the majority of the time we've had this council, a lot of the people on the council are not large token holders. They've been voted in by large token holders because they think, this person is smart or they've got some particular aspect, that they care about. And so I do think that we are getting closer to kind of building tools and establishing norms where there are structures that don't devolve into plutocracy, but we still need a lot more time to kind of tell. Like Synthetix could easily, the existing structure we have, devolve into plutocracy in the next year or so, and we might not realize today that that's going to be an issue.
Right. Okay. And then to wrap up, what do you think are kind of the key pieces missing for DeFi protocols to be able to scale even more effectively? Is it, I don't know, regulatory clarity, better UX? Like what can get DeFi today into the next billion users?
I mean, scaling is obviously an issue. Even now we're still struggling with scaling. We're into September, right? And we were hoping that by kind of March, we'd be in a position where we had like scalable L2s and there'd be a bunch of different options. We're getting options and it's getting better, but we're still not there. So I think it's probably going to be the rest of the year where it's still not even going to be clear what the best scaling solution is, and probably into next year as well. But I do think that without really good L2 scaling on Ethereum that is comprehensive, there's great tooling for, it's going to be hard to scale out at least the Ethereum ecosystem. And then I think more broadly, like what does it take to scale DeFi? We're seeing a lot of people come into the space for other reasons, NFTs and more cultural things. And I do think that the kind of NFT phenomenon and what we're seeing there is actually going to be a bit of a gateway drug into DeFi. And people, once they've got wallets and they've got a little bit of comfort with the idea of transactions, they're going to be more open to, wait a second, why am I getting like 0% yield on my assets sitting in the bank versus putting them in stables and getting 5% yield or something like that.
Totally. Okay. Well, we've come to the end of the panel. It's been super interesting conversation. So the road to scaling DeFi and Web3 is very close. We're just we need the base layer to scale as well as regulatory clarity and so many other things, governance issues. So it was great getting your thoughts on all of that.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Great.